He had not cooked a meal for 2 and 6 years, but there he was, standing in the produce section of a Loblaws on a Wednesday evening, holding a bunch of carrots he didn't need, trying to remember whether he'd already put pasta in the cart. His name was Bennett. Bennett Hale. No, that was taken. That was Gordon. Bennett Forsyth. 41 years old, electrical contractor, father of one 7-year-old girl named Isla, and a man who had become, through no particular plan of his own, very good at doing everything alone. The date had not been his idea. His sister Colleen had been working on him since March, not in an aggressive way. Colleen was never aggressive, but in the quiet, persistent way she'd had since childhood. The way she'd once convinced him to try out for hockey by simply assuming he already had. She'd mentioned a woman she knew from her book club. Mentioned her again in April. Left a sticky note on his fridge during a Sunday visit that said, "Only she's good, Ben." He'd thrown it away. She'd put another one up. He'd finally said yes on a Tuesday in his truck outside a job site in Kanata, because Colleen had called at the exact moment he was tired enough to stop arguing. The arrangement was simple. A restaurant in the Glebe, Saturday at 7. A woman named Sylvie, no photograph, no background details beyond what Colleen offered. She's been through some things. She's steady. You'll like her. He'd written the restaurant name in his phone and spent the next 5 days not thinking about it. Isla, however, had not stopped thinking about it. She found out the way she found everything out, and listening through walls. He'd been on the phone with Colleen in the kitchen, while Isla was supposedly absorbed in her Lego on the living room floor. By the time he hung up, she was in the kitchen doorway, studying him with an expression he recognized as interest she was trying to look like she wasn't having. "You're going on a date," she said. "I'm having dinner with someone." She didn't blink. That's a date. She didn't press further that night. She was strategic about it, which he found both impressive and mildly alarming. It wasn't until Saturday afternoon, when he was standing in front of his closet with the specific uselessness of a man who owned fine workwear and nothing in between, that she materialized behind him. She assessed the closet for 3 seconds. "The gray one," she said. "Why the gray one?" She tilted her head as though the answer was obvious and she was being patient with him. "Because it doesn't have anything on it." He put on the gray shirt. She followed him to the bathroom, where she stood on the edge of the tub to reach his shoulders, and straightened his collar with both hands. Her fingers were small and deliberate. She pressed down on the fabric with the concentration she usually reserved for difficult coloring decisions. "Your hair's doing that thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where it goes sideways." He fixed his hair. She stepped back, considered him with the impartiality of a foreman, and nodded once. Then, just as he was reaching for his jacket, he felt something being slipped into his chest pocket. He turned around. Isla was already backing into the hallway, both hands tucked behind her, wearing an expression that was trying very hard not to be a grin. "What did you just put in there?" "Nothing, Isla." "It's for later," she said. "Only take it out if it feels right." She was 7. She said if it feels right the way other children said pass the ketchup. He reached toward his pocket. She held up one hand with such authority that he actually stopped. He left whatever it was in his pocket. Colleen arrived at 6:45 to stay with Isla, and Bennett kissed the top of Isla's head at the door. She hugged him around the middle and pressed her chin up to look at him. There was something in her face he didn't quite have language for. Something that was more than 7. "Don't try too hard," she said. "Just be normal." He thought about that for the 12 minutes he sat in his car in the driveway before finally pulling out. The restaurant was on Bank Street, the kind of place with exposed brick and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard and candles in old wine bottles. He parked on a side street and walked, arriving 4 minutes early, and then spent those 4 minutes standing outside pretending to look at his phone. The night was cold the way Ottawa evenings get in October. Not brutal yet, but the kind of cold that has intentions. His breath showed in front of him. Across the street, a couple was walking a dog that was wearing a small coat, and the city was doing the thing it did on weekend evenings, filling in with the particular noise of people who had somewhere to be and were glad of it. Bennett did not feel like a person who was glad of it. He felt like a person standing at the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. He was checking the time, 6:58, when he heard footsteps coming up the sidewalk at a pace that had some urgency to it. He looked up. She was moving the way people move when they're running slightly late and have decided not to acknowledge it. Her coat was a deep burgundy. Her hair was dark, pulled back but with pieces that had come loose in the wind and were doing whatever they wanted. She was scanning the entrance, and when her eyes found him, something in her stride changed. Not slowing exactly, but settling into itself, the way a question settles when it finds its answer. He held the door. She stepped into the warmth of the restaurant, and he was about to say something. His name, probably, or some version of hi that wouldn't embarrass him. When she paused just inside the doorway, glanced down at his chest pocket, and said quietly, so only he could hear, "Your daughter left you instructions, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. Bennett's hand was still on the door. He became aware of it only because he'd stopped feeling it. He stood in the warm light of the restaurant entrance and looked at this woman he had never met, and felt something in the floor of his chest shift in a way it hadn't in a long time. She wasn't smiling in a knowing way. There was no performance in it. She was just watching him with a kind of careful steadiness, the way you watch someone when you understand you've just handed them something and you're willing to wait while they figure out what to do with it. The door swung closed behind them. They were given a corner table, which Bennett was grateful for, without knowing how to say so. "Sylvie," explained herself simply, once they were seated. She'd noticed the corner of something sticking out of his breast pocket. A fold of paper, handwriting visible on the edge. She'd recognized it not from what it said but from the way it was written. The way children pressed into the page harder than necessary, as if the words needed to be convinced to stay. "I probably should have kept that to myself," she said. "Probably," Bennett agreed. She laughed, short, a little surprised at herself, and something in his chest loosened a quarter turn. He reached into his pocket. The paper was still there, folded into a neat square. Isla always folded things with the care of someone who considered it part of the work. He unfolded it on the table, smoothing it flat with the side of his hand. It was a drawing, crayon as expected. Two figures side by side on what appeared to be a bridge, or possibly a very wide table. Isla's backgrounds were interpretive. The figures had large round heads and small bodies, and their arms were extended toward each other. Not quite touching, almost. Beneath the drawing, in the large careful letters she used when she was concentrating, "Be brave." Being brave is just being scared and doing it anyway. She was 7. She had apparently been thinking about courage. Bennett sat with it for a moment. The tightness in his throat was inconvenient in a restaurant, and he breathed through it. "She's 7, he said, which wasn't really a sentence, but Sylvie seemed to understand the full weight of it. "How long has it been the two of you?" 6 years. He folded the drawing carefully, following Isla's original creases, since she was 1. Sylvie didn't do the thing people sometimes did, the tilt of the head, the soft voice, the expression that was actually about them and their discomfort with the situation rather than about him. She just nodded once, the nod of someone storing something away, and reached for her water glass. They ordered. The conversation moved the way conversations sometimes do in the first 20 minutes, cautiously, testing its own weight before trusting it. He learned she was a physiotherapist, that she'd grown up in Halifax and come to Ottawa for grad school, and stayed because staying was easier than deciding. She learned he'd built his contracting business from 2 employees to 14, that he drove a truck with 160,000 kilometers on it, because he didn't trust things that were too new, that he'd learned to braid hair from a YouTube channel run by a retired gym teacher in Manitoba. "How long did that take?" she asked. 4 months before Isla stopped correcting me. She has standards. She has a rubric. Sylvie smiled at that, and it was the kind of smile that reached before it left. The dinner found its pace. Bennett had expected it to require more effort, had imagined himself working to sustain it like a man keeping a fire going in wind. But it didn't need that. It moved on its own. The food came. The candle threw its small circle of light. The restaurant noise settled around them like weather, and they were inside it, and it was fine. More than fine. It was somewhere between the main course and the moment the waiter appeared to inquire about dessert that Bennett looked at her across the table and noticed her coat, still on the back of her chair, and saw that one of the buttons was hanging by a thread. He'd noticed it at the entrance and filed it away without examining it. But now he understood something he hadn't before. She had not arrived composed. She had arrived managing composure. The thread on the button, the hair that had lost the argument with the wind. These were not the details of someone who hadn't tried. They were the details of someone who had tried and been met by the ordinary resistance of an ordinary evening, and had come anyway. He recognized that. "Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things all evening. This one's different." He set down his fork. "When you saw the paper in my pocket, you didn't keep it to yourself. Most people would have." Sylvie's eyes moved to her water glass. Not evasively, more the way you look away when you're deciding how honest to be. Then she reached into her bag. She took out her phone, and for a moment he thought she was going to show him something on the screen. But she opened the case. It was the kind with a small slot for cards on the back, and from that slot she drew a folded piece of paper. Not old, exactly, but carried. The kind of fold that had been made and remade until the creases knew where to go. She set it on the table between them. He leaned forward. It was a drawing in pencil, or what had been pencil. The lines were faint now, the way graphite goes when paper has been handled a great deal. Two figures, one seated, one standing with a hand outstretched toward the seated one. Below, in small handwriting that was young but controlled, "You're not stuck. You just haven't moved yet." "My son drew that," Sylvie said. "He was 9. This was 3 years ago when I was in the middle of my divorce." She paused. "He found me one night sitting on the kitchen floor because I didn't have the energy to make it to a chair." He didn't say anything. He went to his room and came back with that. She looked at the paper. "The way you look at something that has been with you so long, it's become part of your internal geography." He couldn't fix anything. He just didn't want me to think I was the only one in the room. Bennett said nothing. The gap between being unable to fix something and being unwilling to do nothing, he knew that gap with his whole body. It didn't need translating. "I've kept it in my phone case since then," Sylvie said. "When I saw the fold of paper in your pocket, I knew what it was. Not what it said, just what it was." She tucked the drawing back carefully. "That's why I said something. I don't usually lead with strange." It wasn't strange. She looked at him. It was a little strange. It was the right kind of strange. They declined dessert at the same moment, without checking with each other, which Bennett filed away as information. They stood on the sidewalk outside at 9:37. The street was quieter than when he'd arrived. The cold more settled now, meaning business. Their breath moved in small clouds that appeared and dissolved before they could become anything. Bennett knew this moment. He'd rehearsed it, vaguely, in the days before. The end of the evening, the handshake, the polite conclusion that would allow him to go back to the life he understood. He was good at conclusions. He'd been building them for 6 years. Sylvie reached into her bag. She took out her phone case, opened it, and held out the folded paper. Her son's drawing, the one she'd carried for 3 years. "I want you to have this," she said. He looked at it in her hand. "That's yours." "I know." She kept her hand extended. "I've kept it because I needed to remember that someone saw me when I was down on the floor. But I don't sit on the floor anymore." A small shift in her expression. Something between rueful and settled. "I think maybe you understand it better than I do right now." He took it. The paper was lighter than it looked. He stood on a sidewalk in the glebe, with a stranger's most important thing in his hand, and felt the full strange weight of being trusted with something that had carried someone through. There were things he wanted to say. He was aware of them the way you're aware of a word that won't surface, present, real, just beyond reach. What came out instead was, "Thank you. Tonight was really good." Sylvie smiled, genuine and a little careful. It was. She turned and walked up Bank Street toward where she'd parked, and Bennett turned the other way toward his side street, shoes on the pavement, the city doing its evening thing around him, indifferent and full. He counted his steps without meaning to. 4, 7, 11, 14. He stopped. He stood on the sidewalk and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late to be comfortable, what he was doing. He had done it before. Not with Sylvie. He had never met Sylvie before tonight, but in the years since Isla's mother left, in the small moments when something possible appeared and he found a way to let it pass. He was reliable that way. He knew how to turn possible into past tense. He had done it enough times that it no longer felt like a choice. The footsteps ahead of him were fading. His heart was doing something unhelpful. He turned around. She was half a block away, hands in her coat pockets, moving at the particular pace of someone who is cold but not quite ready to hurry. Sylvie. She stopped. She turned. He walked back toward her. He didn't say what he'd wanted to say on the sidewalk. That wasn't tonight. It was too cold, and they'd just met, and there were better moments for true things. But he walked back, and they stood together in the orange light of a street lamp, and he asked if she'd like to do this again sometime. She said yes. He said he'd call this week. She nodded. And something in her face suggested she believed him, which felt like more than he'd earned given the previous 15 seconds. He drove home with both pieces of paper on the passenger seat. Colleen let herself out when he came through the door. She read his face in the hallway the way she'd been reading his face since they were kids sharing a house in Sudbury. And she put on her boots without asking a single question, which was the most generous thing she could have done. The house was quiet the way it got after Isla went to sleep. Specifically quiet, shaped around her absence in it. A juice box on the coffee table, a half-built Lego structure on the kitchen floor that had not been there this morning. One sock in the middle of the hallway, its partner nowhere visible. Bennett picked up the sock and set it by the stairs. He turned off the kitchen light. He sat down on the floor in the hallway outside Isla's room, back against the wall, and he put both drawings on the floor in front of him. Isla's on the right, crayon saturated, the two almost touching figures on the bridge or the very wide table, her handwriting large and certain beneath them. Be brave. Being brave is just being scared and doing it anyway. The other on the left. Pencil faded, a seated figure and a standing one with an outstretched hand. The careful young handwriting below it. You're not stuck. You just haven't moved yet. He looked at them for a long time. Two children. Years apart and cities apart. One in Ottawa and one who had grown up watching his mother sit on a kitchen floor in the middle of a life that was coming apart. They hadn't known each other. They would never know they'd ended up here, side by side on a hallway floor in the glebe, saying versions of the same thing to the same person in the same evening. He thought about Sylvie saying she'd kept the drawing because she needed to remember someone had seen her. He thought about the half block he'd walked in the wrong direction before something in him refused to keep going. He thought about the question he hadn't been asking himself directly, the one that had been living quietly underneath everything else for most of 6 years. Not whether Sylvie was good. She plainly was. Not whether the evening had been what he'd hoped. It had been more. The question was the older one, the one that had nothing to do with Sylvie specifically. It was whether he had anything left in him that was still able to open, whether 6 years of building a life that worked, that was sufficient and ordered and safe, had used up the part of him that could want something uncertain. He was 41. He had a daughter who thought about courage the way other kids thought about spelling tests, as something you practiced until you got it. He had spent 6 years being exactly enough, and he had never once stopped to ask whether enough was the same as all he wanted. Isla's door was open 2 inches, the way she needed it. He could hear her breathing, slow and even, deep in whatever 7-year-olds inhabited when they slept. In a few hours she'd wake up and want waffles and want to know everything, and he'd tell her some of it, and she'd supply the rest from her own imagination, which frankly had better production value than reality. He picked up both drawings, held one in each hand. His daughter had slipped a piece of paper into his pocket and sent him out the door with instructions that were, when he removed everything else from them, very simple. Be brave. Being brave is just being scared and doing it anyway. He'd been so busy cataloging his own hesitation that he'd almost missed the fact that she'd already told him what to do. A small sound from behind the door. A shuffle. Then stillness. Then the soft thump of feet finding the floor. Isla appeared in the gap, squinting at the hallway light. Her hair was flattened on one side, and her pajamas had small planets on them, and she looked at him, sitting on the floor the way she looked at most inexplicable adult behavior, with interest and no particular surprise. She came and sat down beside him without being asked, leaning her weight into his arm. He put it around her without thinking. She looked at the 2 drawings on the floor. She picked up her own, looked at it, put it back. Then she picked up the other one and held it the way she held her own work, with both hands and appropriate seriousness. She studied the faded lines, the seated figure, the outstretched hand. She set it down carefully. "Who drew it?" she asked. Her voice still had sleep in it. "A boy," Bennett said. "He was 9. He drew it for someone who needed reminding that things could get better." Isla considered this information the way she considered most things, thoroughly and without rushing. "Does she remember that now?" she asked. "That things got better?" Bennett looked at the 2 drawings on the floor. "Yeah," he said. "I think she does." Isla nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded when information confirmed something she'd already suspected. She stayed beside him a while longer, solid and warm, and then she went back to bed. Bennett sat in the hallway alone. He put both drawings on the kitchen counter. He went to sleep. He called Sylvie on Thursday. They talked for 45 minutes. He called again the following Monday and they talked longer. The first time the 3 of them were in the same place. He was more frightened than he'd been outside the restaurant. He hadn't expected that. He'd managed the restaurant. He'd turned around on the sidewalk. He'd made the calls. And yet, standing in the parking area of Vincent Massey Park on a Saturday in early November, watching Sylvie's car pull in 2 rows over, he felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with himself. Isla was beside him in her orange puffer jacket and her sneakers that she'd outlined in black marker in September and considered an improvement. She was not, for once, talking. She was watching the car. Sylvie got out carrying a canvas bag and a thermos, and the slightly held expression of someone working hard to appear as though they weren't working at all. She was wearing a green scarf he hadn't seen before. Her hair was more sorted today, which he noticed the way you notice when something is different from the last time you saw it. She and Bennett exchanged a look that contained, without words, most of what they'd talked about over the past few weeks. Then they both looked at Isla. Isla looked at Sylvie. Sylvie did not crouch down to Isla's level. She also didn't speak first. She just stood with her bag and her thermos and let Isla take her time. Isla was thorough. She started at Sylvie's face, moved to the canvas bag which had an embroidered bird on it, came back to the face. "Hi," Isla said. "Hi," Sylvie said. That was all for a moment. They walked to the river path. Bennett and Sylvie talked, easy, the way it had been for 3 weeks on the phone. And Isla walked ahead of them, kicking at the last of the fallen leaves, occupied with whatever internal project she ran when she appeared to be doing nothing. Bennett kept half his attention on her the whole time, the particular low-frequency attention of a parent, the one that ran even when everything else was running too. They found a bench near the water, and Sylvie opened her bag and took out a small sketchbook with a green cover. Bennett hadn't known she sketched. He watched her open it without asking about it, and she didn't offer anything. She just started drawing, the pencils moving without urgency. Isla lasted approximately 2 minutes before she began migrating closer. She did it the way she did things she was interested in but not ready to claim. Sideways, incrementally, with pauses that were meant to appear casual and didn't quite. Sylvie kept drawing. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the small presence that had arrived beside her. She just kept the pencil moving, slowly, in the way of someone actually thinking about what they were putting on the page. Isla's chin dropped toward the sketchbook. On the page, a figure was taking shape, small and round-headed, in a jacket with pockets, sneakers with outlines on them, standing near what was clearly water. Isla went very still. Sylvie finished and considered the drawing. Then she held the sketchbook slightly toward Isla, not pushing it, just making it available. "Is that you?" she asked. Her voice was even, unhurried. Isla stared at the page for a long time. The figure had her jacket, her shoes, The specific way she held herself with her weight on one side. It was unmistakably her. Isla took the sketchbook. She held it the way she held anything that mattered, with both hands, level, the right amount of attention. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and produced, because she was Isla, a small tin of colored pencils that went with her everywhere. She selected one, dark blue, her current preference, and she added to the drawing, not to the figure of herself. Beside it, a second figure, taller, with a scarf and a canvas bag with a bird on it. She gave it careful hair. She gave it a thermos. She drew it slowly and with intention, and when she was finished she held the sketchbook at arm's length to look at it the way she assessed her own work. Then she held it out to Sylvie. Sylvie took it. 2 figures on the page, one in pencil, one in dark blue. Different hands, different weights, but on the same paper, in the same cold November light near the water. Bennett was looking at the river. He was looking at the river because if he looked at either of them, something was going to happen in his face that he would prefer to manage without an audience. "She's not by herself anymore," Sylvie said. Her voice was quieter than usual. Isla thought about this. "That's what I was drawing," she said. They stayed until the light changed and the cold made its intentions clear. On the way back, Isla walked between them on the path without being asked, not holding anyone's hand, just between them, kicking at leaves, running a little ahead and then falling back in that way children did when they were comfortable somewhere. At the edge of the parking area, where the path widened out and the cars were visible, Isla looked up at Sylvie. "Are you still scared?" she asked. Just like that. No framing, no approach. The question she'd decided she needed the answer to, offered plainly the way she offered everything. Sylvie looked down at her. She took in Isla's face, serious orange jacket, marker outlined shoes, the particular quality of her attention. Something moved through Sylvie's expression that was too layered to land on a single word. Not quite sadness, not quite relief. Something that lived in the space where both of those could be true at the same time. She shook her head, small and honest. Isla accepted this the way she accepted things she'd already believed, without needing it repeated. She reached up and squeezed Sylvie's hand once, and then let go and ran ahead because she'd spotted something in the leaves near the parking curb that required investigation. Sylvie and Bennett stood at the edge of the path and watched her go. He thought about a number of things in that moment and said none of them, because there was nothing he needed to say that the afternoon hadn't already said with more precision than he was capable of. He thought about a folded drawing in a chest pocket, about the 12 minutes in his driveway and the 14 steps he'd taken in the wrong direction, about a 7-year-old who understood something that had taken him 6 years to get within reach of, that you didn't need to be ready. You just needed to be willing to be scared and do it anyway. From ahead of them, Isla turned around. "Come on," she called. Bennett looked at Sylvie. Sylvie was already walking.